are re-energized, and we are in the book of Judges, right? Book of Judges. We gave you the dates prior to lunch from the times of Caleb, 1400 BC, to the death of Samson, about 1049 BC. And we stopped really with this particular slide. And this is a good way to understand at least the first 16 chapters of Judges. Judges goes through chapter 21. It's really A, B, C, D. And a good way to understand this is really to begin at verse 10 in chapter 2. So if you want to turn to Judges chapter 2, verse 10, you will see one of the saddest verses in the Bible. Judges 2, verse 10, and then we'll transition to verses 11 and following. Judges 2:10 says, "And all that generation," so that would be the Caleb-Joshua generation, the generation that inherited the promised land, the generation that was part of all of those victories by means of the Ark of the Covenant. That generation were gathered to their fathers. It's a good way to talk about death. Death does not separate you from the community, right? You're gathered with your fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, all caps means Yahweh, didn't know the beauty and the power of that name, the great I am, or the work that he had done for Israel. And the big question is, why didn't the next generation know? And the answer is simple as it is tragic. No one told them. No one told them. And so this is why we accented this morning the importance of educating by what people are taught and what they are caught in terms of God's truth. So that's, of course, the burden of every parent and grandparent and great-grandparent, is we want to give the faith on to the next generation. But in this case, that generation, the Joshua-Caleb generation, didn't tell the next generation. And so what happens? Well, then that's the transition to verse 11. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. There's that Baal, Hadad, Canaanite fertility deity. And they abandoned the Lord, the next verse says, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. There's that one of 125 reminders of the gospel. The liberating God who with an outstretched arm and mighty hand delivered them from Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, Baal and Asherah, and bowed down to them. They provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Ashtaroth is simply a plural form of Asherah, which is the feminine partner of Baal. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. He gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hands of their surrounding enemies. And we saw that right before lunch. So that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hands of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, like Ehud and Jephthah, Gideon, Samson, etc. They whored, that's the ESV here. They whored, it's a good word. It's very literalistic from the Hebrew. They were prostitutes on two levels. The first level would be literally. They went after these sacred prostitutes. They also abandoned their husband, which would be the Lord, who brought them out of Egypt. So they forsook the Lord, not only literally, sexually, but also spiritually. They went after other lovers. So it continues then, after other gods, and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, as they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt. That is actually a very important phrase in the whole book of Judges. More corrupt. It gets worse and worse and worse and worse. See, each judge is just a little bit more corrupt than the predecessor. By the time, of course, you get to Samson, right, the wheels have come off the car. This is a sex-addicted Nazarite, right, who will sell his soul for a woman named Delilah. So this more corrupt phrase in verse 19 is very important. So it got worse and worse. So we have this slide here. Apostasy, the people sin, as we saw that. Judges chapter 2 is a nice overview and summary of the book. Battering, the Lord is going to send foreign armies to discipline his people. They cry out, and God raises up a judge. And the judges are kind of more like lean, mean, green fighting machines, right? They're more military than we would probably say concerned with legal matters. And so this is the cycle. It goes over and over and over again. So 4 times at the end of the book, and the last verse in the book, in chapter 21, verse 25. Judges 21:25. And we have this refrain, as I said, 4 times in chapters 17 through 21. But the book ends, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So that appears 4 times, and that, of course, is very suggestive that this cycle of idolatry and suffering and being battered by foreign armies, this cycle will only stop if we get a what? A king. A king. We have to have a king. And the king then is the solution. And the king, of course, the second king in Israel, is the solution. And this would be a slide of David. David. David in Hebrew means beloved. Beloved, David. He's beloved. And we all know something about David. David began his reign roughly at 1000 BC. And this particular picture is supposed to be one of David. Let's kind of plot things. David makes Jerusalem his capital. Jerusalem is the capital. This is a politically savvy move. Up to this point, Jebusites lived in Jerusalem. You can read about it in 2 Samuel chapter 5. It was so-called neutral territory. No tribe actually owned Jerusalem. It's much like our nation's history. Let's not make Philadelphia or New York the capital of America, right? Let's make Washington, D.C. the capital, somewhat of a neutral spot, right? Just so. David chooses Jerusalem. He attacks it in 2 Samuel 5, and it, at that point, becomes the city of David. And what does David put in Jerusalem? There it is, okay? It's kind of hard to see, but that would be the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant. Remember God's real presence among his people. Those verses at the end of Numbers chapter 10. Arise, O Lord, speaking to the Ark of the Covenant. Return, O Lord, speaking to the Ark of the Covenant. So David takes the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And God then makes a promise. Remember, there are 3 divine commitment covenants in the Old Testament: Noah, Abraham, and now David. And what this slide is trying to communicate is there's our symbol for God. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God promises David an everlasting dynasty. It's again called an everlasting covenant, much like Noah and Abraham, much like Jeremiah 32 verse 40, much like, remember, Hebrews chapter 13 verse 20. Everlasting covenant. There will always be a Davidic heir on the throne of Israel. Huge promise, right? Huge promise. And you can see on this slide that this denotes David's conquered territory. So David was king in Hebron for 7 years, okay? Then he became king over the northern kingdom after 7 years in Hebron, and that's when he claimed Jerusalem as his capital. On the gold part of the map would then indicate the extent of the Davidic Empire, which goes down to the Gulf of Aqaba in the south and all the way up close to Tyre in Lebanon in the north. And there would be some of his enemies that he defeated. Now, after David has public victory, very important, he has private defeat. And we all know about that, right? It's called Bathsheba in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Once he has this adulterous affair with Bathsheba and has Uriah the Hittite killed, murdered, then the wheels fall off the Davidic car. The real intrigue for the rest of Samuel and into 1 Kings chapter 1 is who is going to be the Davidic heir? Who's going to get these promises of an everlasting kingdom with the crowns on David's head? So the first person who is heir to the throne is one Amnon. Amnon, A-M-N-O-N. Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. You may remember that. And what does David do? Answer, nothing. For people like me and some of you, that is a harsh warning where you can have public victory, right? Public, very public victory, and have private defeat. David does not discipline Amnon after he rapes his half-sister Tamar. Doesn't do a thing. So who comes along and carries out the dirty business? One Absalom. That is symbolized by this next crown. Absalom comes, the next heir in line, and he kills Amnon. And what does David do? Nothing. David doesn't have control of his personal life, even as he has great praise and adulation in the public arena. And that is a recipe for disaster. So, Absalom looks at his dad and says, "Dad, if you're not going to be the king, I'll be the king." So Absalom, represented here, revolts. There is a civil war that goes on in 2 Samuel, beginning in chapter 15. And Absalom dies in the process. He's killed by David's general, one Joab. And Joab is not the kind of person you want on your board of elders. Let's just put it that way. Joab's solution to any problem is to kill the problem. And that's what Joab does. He kills Absalom. The next one in line would be one Adonijah. Adonijah. And he's a Davidic son, and he says, "I'm in charge." You read about this, though, in 1 Kings chapter 1. And apparently, though we're not told earlier in Samuel, apparently, before he died, David promised Bathsheba, what? Your son Solomon is the heir to the throne. Well, Adonijah didn't get that memo. Adonijah proclaimed himself as king, and Solomon at this time, along with his very powerful mother, Bathsheba, says, "We are in charge." So Adonijah is to put it bluntly, hosed. He's killed. So that leaves who is the heir? Not Amnon or Absalom or Adonijah. All this is endlessly confusing, I understand. All right, but remember, I can. And the kingdom falls to who? Solomon. So why would Solomon have these little 4 lambs by his crown? It's a reminder of this pivotal narrative in 2 Samuel 12. 2 Samuel 12 is just after the Uriah the Hittite Bathsheba affair. And David's feeling invincible until a prophet comes along. And we will talk momentarily about kings and prophets. But this is a classic king and prophetic confrontation. So Nathan can't come out and say, "You miserable, rotten sinner, repent." Can't do that. He has to be more subtle. So Nathan tells a parable that there was a poor man who only had a little ewe lamb, and a rich man came along and took the poor man's little ewe lamb. And what should happen to that rich man? Well, David says, among other things, the rich man shall repay the poor man 4 lambs. And then 2 Samuel 12:7, a famous verse, even in Hebrew. Nathan says in the Hebrew, "Atah ha'ish," which when interpreted means, loose translation, "you the man." You the man. Okay, and it comes in English, "You are the man. You're the rich man who took for the poor man." And who did he take? He took the little lamb Bathsheba. And he had Uriah murdered. Okay, so that is really the palace intrigue from the Davidic promise in 2 Samuel 7 all the way through 1 Kings chapter 1. Okay, so there's a little bit more of David. What we want to pick up then is this little picture on the bottom right. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. 1 Samuel 13:14, a very famous verse. It says, David was a man after God's own heart. Right? We've heard that before. 1 Samuel 13:14. David was a man after God's own heart. Well, what do you mean after God's own heart? Right? His family is a dysfunctional mess. He's an adulterer and a murderer. How dare they call David a man after God's own heart? So we have to unpack that phrase, at least momentarily, to understand what that means. And this is what it means. David is a man after God's own heart because he has one central place for worship. Remember that Deuteronomy program? The land, the Lord alone, one place for worship, blessing, and curses? David fulfills that plan in Deuteronomy and makes Jerusalem the one place. David then brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, and David, of course, is anointed as king. Whatever you say bad about David, you have to agree that he was not a rampant idolater. Whenever he was confronted with his sin, what does he say in 2 Samuel 7? After Nathan says, Atah Aish, you the man. David says, you're right. And then we have Psalm 51, create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a right spirit within me. David is a man after God's own heart because David isn't perfect. But when confronted, David is humble and looks to Yahweh. That's what it means. And so that's what this little picture represents. Okay, so we have in David a united kingdom. A united kingdom. And, of course, David dies. And in 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon becomes king. This is the map of Solomon's empire. And what I want us to notice here would be these three little icons by three cities, which really speak volumes. Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. What did Solomon do with those three cities? These would be Solomon's so-called chariot cities. Chariot cities. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17. Someone said, "Will your voice hold?" I said, "If not, the vicar's preaching tonight." Deuteronomy 17. To understand these chariot cities, to begin to understand, and this is the point, with Solomon we have the beginning of the end. Everybody got that? With Solomon we have the beginning of the end. And why is that? Well, let's take a look at it. Deuteronomy 17 is the job description for the king. All right? And what does it say? Deuteronomy 17, verse 16. Speaking of the king, it says, "He must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again." So don't have a lot of horses and don't have a lot of chariots. Look at verse 17. And don't have a lot of wives. Okay. Men, this is actually sound advice. All right? Very sound advice. Okay? Don't have a lot of wives. And it goes on. Don't have a lot of gold and silver. Got it? Not a lot of horses and chariots. Not a lot of wives. Not a lot of gold and silver. Solomon, strike one. He has a lot of horses and chariots. Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Strike two, he has a lot of wives. How many wives? 1 Kings 11:3. Solomon had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. And 1 Kings 11:3 continues. And his wives led him astray. I almost want to say, forgive me, all females, please forgive me in advance for what I'm about to say. But I almost want to read 1 Kings 11:3 as, and his wives led him into debt. Just kidding. See, I knew it. Don't stone me. Don't stone me. Right. But imagine that. Men having to keep track of 1,000 Visa cards. See, yeah. Okay, so Solomon has horses and chariots, Hatzor, Megiddo, Gezer. He has 1,000 wives, and he has a lot of Hebrew shekels, gold and silver. See, according to Deuteronomy 17, Solomon struck out. Solomon is the antithesis of the job description. That's what I mean. With Solomon, we have the beginning of the end. Especially, let's go back to horses and chariots. Psalm 20, verse 7 is actually a nice summary of what prophets were all about. Psalm 20, verse 7 says, "Some trust in horses and some trust in chariots, but we trust in the name of Yahweh, the Lord our God." God does not want his people to put their hope in horses and chariots. In the day, horses and chariots were the nuclear bombs. You had horses and chariots and you had a mighty military machine. And Psalm 20 verse 7 says, don't trust in horses and chariots. But kings, beginning with Solomon, began to do that. Big time. Solomon also built a temple, didn't he? Solomon wasn't all good or bad, right? Solomon would be a lot like us. We are sinner and saint. Old person, new person. So that's what we see in Solomon. So this is the good part. Not the 1,000 wives with Visa cards, but he actually builds a temple, and he dedicates it in 1 Kings chapter 8. So take a look at that. Very long prayer that Solomon prays here. But what I want us to notice in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and we're picking it up at verse 11. 8:11 in 1 Kings, I think I said Samuel. 1 Kings 8, let's pick it up at verse 10. And when the priest came out of the holy place, a cloud, that's kind of what we want to pick up. Remember the cloud in the book of Exodus and Jesus' baptism and Jesus' transfiguration, Jesus' ascension, Jesus' second coming? There's the cloud again. The cloud filled the house of the Lord so that the priest could not stand and minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. That sounds a lot like the end of Exodus, when God came and dwelled in the tabernacle. Now God, just so, is dwelling in Solomon's temple. So throughout the Old Testament, as we've seen now several times, God takes up residency with his people, whether it's the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, or in this case, Solomon's temple. But how did Solomon do it? Solomon spent 7 years building his temple. How long did Solomon spend building his own house? 13 years. That should tell us something, right? That Solomon isn't this perfect, idyllic king that maybe sometimes we picture him as being. What we have up here is that he built, this is supposed to be a picture of Solomon. And notice where his hands are, right? He is going against these mandates in Deuteronomy 17 with the horses, the chariots, the women, and the money. So there's Solomon, and he is forcing his people into what? Slavery. Slavery. Who's the last king that enslaved Israel? That would be, remember, the king of the Exodus, Thutmose III. In a way, Solomon is a new Pharaoh. He is enslaving his people to build his bachelor pad of 13 years and the temple of 7 years. And what do we have at the bottom here? What Solomon does with the tribal allotments, remember we looked at that momentarily in the book of Judges, is he does away with all of that. He does away with the tribal boundaries. Instead, he sets up 12 different administrative districts. Oh my! So now Judah isn't Judah anymore, and Benjamin isn't Benjamin anymore, and Dan and Asher and Naphtali, they've lost their ancestral boundaries as well. Solomon redistributes the land, and he puts governors over them, so now we have 12, making the people slaves, and of course, he will go as far as to whip people into submission. So that's why I said, with Solomon, we have the beginning of the end. And you could summarize the whole Old Testament with what I'm about to say. That does not mean that the seminar is over, though. God could get Israel out of Egypt, but he couldn't get Egypt out of Israel. Right? He got them out of Egypt, but he couldn't get Egypt out of Israel because Solomon is simply another what? Pharaoh. Enslaving God's people, redistributing the land. And so, with Solomon, last time I'll say it, we have the beginning of the end. Okay, so what happens then after Solomon is the kingdom splits. The kingdom splits. And this is where, quite often, Old Testament history starts getting a little fuzzy. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 12. 1 Kings chapter 12. And the year is 932 BC. That's what we're reading in 1 Kings 12, 932 BC. And this is the split, okay? You might wonder what's going on here. There are the chariot cities and horses, Hatzor, Megiddo, Gezer. Solomon had an international fleet. That's what these boats are doing in Ezen, Geber, and Tyre. Solomon dies, and his son is Rehoboam. Rehoboam is pardon the vulgar language, but Rehoboam is the number one class jerk of the Bible. Why is that? Okay. Well, let's pick it up in verse 1, 1 Kings 12. Rehoboam went to Shechem, that's Solomon's son, the new king, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. All right? So you see where Shechem is on our little map? Okay. So, honey, let's go to Shechem. They're going to make me king. All right, well, let me pack my makeup bag and I'll be right with you. Okay. And so, Jeroboam, verse 2, the son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt where he had fled from King Solomon. See, you might want to get out of Dodge if Solomon's in charge. Jeroboam returned from Egypt. They sent and called him. Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy. Here it is. They lightened the hard service of your father and heavy yoke on us. We'll serve you. He said to them, go away for 3 days, then come again to me. So the people went away. King Jeroboam took counsel from the old men, the elders, the people with wisdom and knowledge and understanding, and they said what? They said, verse 7, if you will be a servant, oh, this is huge. The king is to be a servant of the people. And we can't help but see a prefiguring and a foreshadowing of the king who is the servant who will wash people's feet. But that's the job description. See, be a servant. That's the way. And you're all in leadership positions. I understand that. What's the best way to lead? Be humble. Be humble. Be a servant of people, right? That's what the old guys say, okay? But, verse 8, this is why he's kind of the jerk of the Bible. He abandoned the counsel of the old men, and he went to his what? His college fraternity brothers. Loose translation of the Hebrew here, okay, all right? And they said what? The young men, verse 10, who had grown up with him said, thus you shall speak to this people. Your father made your yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. And now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. Read my lips. I will raise your taxes. See, okay, that's kind of, maybe a political equivalent. But Rehoboam is going to what? My father disciplined you with whips. We saw that. But I will discipline you with scorpions. That is not a way to win friends and influence people. So that's why we have a split, right? Jeroboam, see, this guy who was a political leader under Solomon's reign, who finally had to go to Egypt, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, is now going to take the north, and Rehoboam will get the south. So at this point, the kingdom is divided. What's the year? 932 BC. And like I said, this is where it gets a little confusing. So let's back up a little bit and make sure we have our bearings. The tribal league would be during the judges' time, right? That was not the best of times. There was no king in Israel. That's how the book ends in Judges 21. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so God says we need a king. So the first king, we haven't talked about him yet, is Saul. Okay, Saul is rejected by God. This little check mark says 1st and 2nd Kings will approve you or disapprove you. Saul from the tribe of Benjamin is rejected, and then, of course, David. And Solomon is actually approved. The only reason why is because he built the temple and he's Davidic. All right? Solomon kind of passed the test by the hair of his what? Chinny chin chin. All right? But Kings approves of Solomon, but not completely, right? And then here would be all of the 19 Davidic kings. The 19 Davidic kings. I used to tell my students at the seminary, memorize though, there will be a test this afternoon. With the dates, and their mothers' names too. All right. What we want to see in Judah, right? Judah's the southern kingdom. Judah is all one color. What does that symbolize? They are all Davidic. They're all Davidic. With one exception, one Athaliah. You see Athaliah? She's in parentheses. She's actually a queen from the house of Ahab. She didn't last too long. All right? She doesn't last too long. But there is one kind of bump in the road or a hiccup. Now, many of these kings are what? Given approval in the book of Kings. All right? The book of Kings approves of these Judean kings using two criteria. Number one, are you Davidic? Number two, do you support the Solomonic temple? Got it? That's all you need for a passing grade. Are you Davidic? Do you support the Solomonic temple? Well, you can see that kings like Ahaz, Manasseh, the last four certainly are Davidic, but they do not support the temple. That is to say, they bring in foreign deities into the Solomonic temple. They corrupt God's presence in the temple. All right? Several of these are assassinated by the people. All right? You can kind of see the X's there. Two of the greatest kings after David, many of us know, would be Hezekiah and Josiah. In 1st and 2nd Kings, both Hezekiah and Josiah are described this way. Their heart was fully devoted to Yahweh the Lord. They didn't turn to the right or the left. Well, so that's the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is a horse of a different color, even a slide of a different color, right? The northern kingdom has any number of different dynasties, right, as depicted by the colors. Jeroboam, we read about him in 1 Kings chapter 12. Jeroboam starts, but he doesn't last too long in terms of erecting a dynasty. This is kind of a job where you want to have pretty good life insurance, if you get the picture here. Most of the time, these kings were assassinated by their successor. So don't turn your back very long. You may get it stuck there. So what do we have? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different dynasties, 19 kings, 19 on each side. That's a good way to kind of recall that. And just as, going back to the Judean slide, in 587, remember that big question we asked in terms of Deuteronomy? How long will they stay in the land? Well, the south stayed in the land. If they got it in 1400, they stayed until what? 587. And we'll come back to the Babylonian exile. The north, though, stayed in their land until 721. 721. So the north ends rather abruptly after 200 years. The south lasts another, 50 years, or 150 years after the end of the north. Okay, so this kind of gives you the rest of the Old Testament. Who's who and what's what. And as I said, it gets a little frustrating because you have two sets of kings and two sets of histories and two different ways of looking at things. Please note that the northern kings are never approved, right? There's no little check mark by any of these people. Why is that? Well, they're not Davidic, and they don't support the Solomonic temple. In fact, if you would look at the end of 1 Kings chapter 12, you would see what Jeroboam the first does. Remember Jeroboam, son of Nebat? He does at least three things. The first thing he does is he sets up golden calves. Oh no, he didn't read Exodus chapter 32. He sets up golden calves in Dan, which is way north, and in Bethel. Oops, don't do that. But he sets up golden calves. He allows non-Levites to serve in those places in Dan and Bethel. And Jeroboam changes the liturgical calendar. That would be something like, all right, Ash Wednesday is going to be on Labor Day. And Christmas, that's on the 4th of July. And Easter, that's going to be my birthday. See, all right? That would not probably work well anywhere in a Christian church. But Jeroboam changes Passover. He changes Day of Atonement. He changes the Feast of Weeks. So those are the three things that Jeroboam does. And throughout the rest of Kings, the narrator, the author of 1st and 2nd Kings said, and so, like let's say Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. That goes on and on and on like a broken record. And now we know what those sins are. None of them are given approval. As I said, none are Davidic and none support the Solomonic temple. They support the worship of golden calves in Dan and Bethel. All right, so what happens then is with the beginning of the monarchy, the first monarch or king being Saul, we have prophets. All right? Now, I'm going to use this term that the literature uses, classical prophets. And I simply want to say that so that we understand. There are prophets before who? Samuel. Abraham's called a prophet in Genesis chapter 20, verse 7. Moses is a prophet. Miriam is a prophetess. All right? So there are prophets before Samuel. But Samuel's called the first classical prophet because classical prophets are there to keep kings in line. All right? Kings in line. And so with the first king, Saul, from the tribe of Benjamin, you need Samuel to keep Saul in line. That's a so-called classical prophet. Now, what we have here is very helpful. The prophets in white are prophets who do not write books. Okay? So, for example, Samuel didn't write Samuel. All right? It bears his name, 1st and 2nd Samuel, but he didn't write the book. Okay? Ahijah, Nathan we talked about. Ahijah, 1 Jehu, Elijah, Elisha, Micaiah, Shemaiah. All of these were prophets. They didn't write a book. Who, however, wrote the first prophetic book? Oh, one of my favorite dead people. Amos. Amos. Amos is the first prophet to write a book. That's why we're so excited. St. Michael, we're going to do Lent, and we're going to look at Amos. Not Andy, just Amos. Okay? All right? All right? And Amos sets the template or the pattern for the rest of the prophetic corpus. Everybody else, Isaiah, Habakkuk, Malachi, Ezekiel, Hosea, they all fashion themselves after who? Famous Amos. All right? Amos comes along during what? The reign of a second Jeroboam, right? Jeroboam, son of what? Joash, right? Amos then is a prophet who speaks to the north. Everybody see that? And he speaks, and we'll see this icon now for the rest of the afternoon. That's an Assyrian king. An Assyrian king. So Amos comes along, and he writes 9 chapters. And he does that during Assyrian times, and Amos speaks to the north, which quite often in the Bible is called Israel, right? And then the southern kingdom is quite often called Judah. Now, going to the bottom of the slide. After Amos comes Hosea and Isaiah. Isaiah 1 to 39 is really speaking to Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. 40 to 66 speaks to exiles in Babylon. So that's why we have Isaiah 1 to 39, 40, 66, kind of broken up there. After Isaiah, we have Micah, right? Then Jeremiah, etc. Not to overshadow one Huldah. Huldah is a prophetess. Of course, we don't have a book named Huldah, but she was a contemporary of our good friend Jeremiah. Many of these then are after the exile, right? Haggai, etc. So we go to, it's pretty simple. During this time of prophets, writing prophets, we have Assyrians, and then we have Egypt and Babylon. Okay? Those are the three kind of big players here. What we are going to do after we look at a classic prophetic message is we want to zero in on three different prophets, really for the rest of our time together, and that's going to be Isaiah, all right? And then we are going to look at Jeremiah, and then we are going to look at our good friend Ezekiel. So you might circle those, and so you know when they lived. Isaiah in the great 8th century, when prophecy began, writing down texts. And then Jeremiah is going to see the end of his nation, Judah, right? And Ezekiel, he was actually exiled to Babylon in 597 BC, and he will then prophesy from the land of the two rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris, to be exact. All right, so there you have it. If you can memorize that, you have a pretty good sense of what happens really with the reign of Saul, right, and Samuel. And of course, Samuel, the first prophet, we talked about how his mother Hannah was barren in 1 Samuel 2, verse 5. So we really go from 1 Samuel, right, all the way through 2 Kings and those historical books. And then, of course, we have prophets, not only writing prophets, but also speaking prophets who come alongside of the kings. What I want us to do before our break, all right, we are just about 7 minutes before our break, turn to 2 Kings chapter 2. 2 Kings chapter 2. And our goal in looking at 2 Kings 2 and then 2 Kings 13 is to better understand this dynamic between the king and the prophet, right? Because that's really what this slide is showing us. Kings and prophets. What was the dynamic? And as I said earlier, prophets were to keep kings in line, at least these classical prophets, beginning with Samuel. So 2 Kings chapter 2. Elijah, who was almost Mr. Prophecy himself, ascends into heaven, and Elisha says this in verse 11. 2 Kings 2:11. And so they still went on and talked, behold, chariots and fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. Verse 12. Elisha, right, okay, so there are two guys up there, Elijah and Elisha. They're always kind of confusing. But Elisha says of Elijah, very important, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. Got it? What is Elisha saying about Elijah? The real power The real nuclear power that is associated with horses and chariots, that resides in the prophet. Oh my gosh. Did kings like to hear that? Not at all. So that is the prophetic message. Remember, we talked about Psalm 20, verse 7. Some trust in horses, some trust in chariots, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Elijah, with God's word on his lips and in his heart and spoken, that's the real power. So who trumps who? Prophet trumps king. And the kings just love it, don't they? Not at all. Look then what happens to Elisha. When Elisha dies in chapter 13 of 2 Kings, Elisha dies. And what do we have? We have a king mourning for Elisha. And what does he say? Verse 14 in 2 Kings 13. When Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die, Joash, king of Israel, okay, so Joash, king of Israel, up here, and what does he say? He says, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horses. That's the only time you have that phrase spoken about a person. So this is revolutionary, that the prophetic word of Yahweh has the final say over the kings and their horses and chariots. So that is the prophetic message. Trust in Yahweh alone. All right, so here is another look at what prophets do. Written prophets as well as these prophets like Elisha and Elijah. So here's just any prophet. Pick your favorite prophet, okay? And the prophet comes along, and remember that sixth part of Sinai? What does he say? It's what? Broken. Broken. How can you break Sinai? Only one way. Unrepentant idolatry. That's it. That's it. So the prophetic message comes along. He's a good left-handed preacher, right? Okay. And he says, Sinai is broken. And remember, maybe you don't, the sixth part of this, what's the sixth part? If you worship the Lord, you stay in the land. If you don't, remember that little frowning face? You are what? Exiled from the land. So as we go back to this particular slide, okay, that shows kind of everything you want to know about kings and prophets. Why was the north exiled by the Assyrians? Why was the south exiled by the Babylonians? Because they broke Sinai. Got it? Okay, so that's kind of the prophetic message here. So what is God going to do? He is, first of all, going to send the Assyrians. The Assyrians. Has God used foreign armies earlier to discipline his people? Yes. That would be what book? If you were standing where I was standing right now, you would say, we all need a caffeine break. So I shouldn't ask you a question. You're probably saying, the Dallas Cowboys. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. But the answer to the question is the book of Judges. You with me here? When did God send foreign armies earlier? In the book of Judges. Remember the Moabites and Amalekites and Hittites and Hivites and flea bites and mosquito bites and Bud Lights and Miller Lights? You understand, okay? All right. Now he's sending who? The Assyrians. All right, so God is behind the Assyrians coming in, and what? I'm just going to go back to this slide. God is behind the Assyrians defeating and destroying the northern kingdom. That's the prophetic message. You can look at it, for example, in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5. where he calls Assyria the rod of his anger. So God sends the Assyrians in the 8th century to kick the northern kingdom and the capital of Samaria out of the land. In the 6th century, he sends who? The Babylonians, along with the Egyptians. So there you have the prophetic message. Sinai's broken. God is going to wake his people up through the use of foreign armies, whether it's Assyria, Babylon, or Egypt. Is that the end of Israel? Has the fat lady sung? Has mighty Casey struck out? We'll get to that after a break. We are at break time. Look at this. We have mints. We have mints. If you have bad breath, this is the place. Okay. There are mints, and there are probably a few other things. Come back, please, in 14 minutes, the long-awaited drawing by the vicar for our Lutheran Study Bibles.